Hi everyone, and welcome to our short course Supporting Students with Anxiety in Tertiary Education. Over the next hour or so, this is what we plan to do. We'll be discussing the nature of anxiety, some of the mechanisms involved with anxiety, giving a bit of a definition of what anxiety is. We'll be hearing from students who suffer from anxiety and how this has impacted on their ability to function. We'll explore anxiety in the context of Australian university students in particular. Then we'll learn some basic strategies, and these strategies relate to how we can assist students who may be suffering. And then finally, we'll be talking to academic staff about their experiences in working with students and some of the strategies they may have implemented. So what is anxiety? It's not uncommon that when people see somebody who's anxious, they'll say something like, oh, it's just all in their head. And in fact, I'd agree with that, because within the head is the brain. And the brain has hardwired into it systems that have developed which enable us to perceive threat, to evaluate threat, and to respond to threat. These are fundamental mechanisms that enable our species to survive. So fundamentally, anxiety consists of neurological mechanisms. But what happens when someone is suffering from anxiety is that their normal fight or flight response, those systems will go into overdrive and they'll feel overwhelmed by what's going on. And this perception of a threat, a significant threat, is going to result in a chemical cascade. And here we're talking primarily about things like norepinephrine and epinephrine or adrenaline, and things like cortisol, the stress hormones. But what happens as a result of these chemicals is that there are profound physiological changes. And these physiological changes, of course, consist of things like an accelerated heart rate, where the individual will feel like their heart is beating out of their chest. They'll feel butterflies in their tummy. They'll feel that sense of intestinal distress because blood's been diverted from a non-essential area, digestion, into their major muscle groups, which often are feeling hot and flushed with blood. People will experience accelerated respiration to the point where they can hyperventilate, they can feel really short of breath. People will experience sweating. All these things arise as a result of the perception of threat and this excessive response that the brain is generating to that threat. And these things have significant impacts on the person's ability to function. So things like cognition, their ability to think, their ability to focus on something, their ability to take in new information, their ability to weigh up that information, their ability to make decisions. All these components of cognitive functioning can be impaired. They'll suffer impacts on their emotional functioning. So people will feel excessive feelings of fear and anxiety, but they'll also feel feelings of distress and feelings of depression and feelings of being overwhelmed. And people will then also experience impacts on their social functioning. So there'll often be a withdrawal from the very people who can help them, people who've perhaps even helped them in the past. And then individuals with anxiety will often feel stigma. That is, they'll be acutely self-conscious of how they're feeling and how they're responding, and they'll be acutely conscious of their faults, and this will further impact on their ability to seek help and to overcome the problem. It's good to note that anxiety comes in many different forms, many different clinical forms. These can include things like GAD or generalized anxiety disorder, panic attacks, where people feel an overwhelming sense of dread and feeling like they're going to die, and specific phobias, situations that arise which cause the individual to feel excessively threatened and respond accordingly. Fundamentally, though, anxiety is characterized by an excessive worry or an excessive fear or a feeling of dread, a feeling of like, this is too much for me, I'm going to die. Symptoms can include things like shortness of breath, heart palpitations, excessive sweating, and fatigue. And these have then impacts, negative impacts on the person's sleeping patterns. Usually people will have insomnia. They'll have negative impacts on their mood. Not only will they feel anxious and worried, they'll often feel depressed about what's going on. And they'll also suffer from impairments to motivation. their ability to get onto the task that they need to do, to stay on the task that they need to do, will be significantly impaired. And along with all those things, there is frequently increased avoidance, that is social avoidance, isolating themselves from friends and family, the sort of people who would normally be able to help them. And then people will frequently have irritability, just a shortness and a sense of like, I don't want to be around people, and I feel like the people around me are further exacerbating the problem. So how common is anxiety? The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare notes that about 20% of Australian adults experience some form of mental disorder over any 12-month period. Of those various disorders, anxiety is the most common. So about 14% of Australian adults will report some form of anxiety disorder within a 12-month period. And research here in Australia indicates very strongly that students who are in the university sector experience anxiety disorders at a much higher rate than the general population. We have probably all suffered from some form of anxiety in the past. You may think back to when you applied for a job or a promotion, or when you had to sit in front of an interview panel and how that felt and how you worked with your own feelings of fear. We may have had a health crisis or perhaps some interpersonal crisis that came along, and that caused us to be destabilised for a period of time. And as we go through this course today, what I'd encourage you to do is to reflect on what that was like for you. And in particular, to think about what sort of things helped you with that anxiety in the past, and perhaps who helped you with that anxiety in the past.